Okay, welcome to an introductory lesson on the guidelines for writing in four parts. Or another way of thinking of that, how to write like Bach. Because remember, we are learning how to write music of a particular time and place, which would be roughly the 1600s, 1750 or so, and primarily in Europe. But that is the crux of what a ton of music we listen to now is based on, hence the reason we're learning all of this stuff. So these are going to be guidelines. You could think of them as rules as well. In fact, I would go so far as to hand you out a sheet that I will link here as well that's called the 10 Commandments for Writing in Four Parts. But the thing to keep in mind is that these are really guidelines if we are aiming to write like these composers. They are not actual rules for music because music is an art form and you can do anything you want as long as you like it, and maybe other people will too. So these are just guidelines to write in four voices, four parts, in order to sound as though you were a composer in Europe from in that time period, in the common practice period. So, for the rest of this, we'll be assuming that these rules are rules because if nothing else, you will need to follow them in order to get full credit on assignments and quizzes and tests and the AP exam in May. All right, here we go. First thing to talk about is voices. What do we mean by voices? Voices obviously can mean the human voice, a singing voice, but it doesn't have to. It literally just means any instrument or device or voice that creates a tone or pitch. So the soprano could be a soprano voice, but it could also be a soprano saxophone. It could be a flute. It could be a trumpet. It honestly could be a trombone. It could be literally any instrument. It just means that it is the highest voice heard. Usually written in the treble clef, especially for our purposes in this class, we'll be using primarily the grand staff. So the soprano, or the highest voice, would be in the treble clef of the grand staff. The alto, again, second from the top. In an orchestra, this could be easily thought as the violin twos, sopranos being the violin ones. Obviously, there are such things as alto saxophones. Some of you play them. But really all it means is that it is the second from the top voice. Again, in the grand staff, it's going to be written on the top line in the treble clef for our purposes. And then we have tenor, which again, same story, can mean an actual human tenor, but it also could mean just an instrument that is third from the top, second from the bottom. And again, for our purposes in grand staff, it's going to be in the bass clef and the lower line of the grand staff. And then finally we have bass, or the lowest voice. Again, also in the bass clef. Obviously in the orchestra we have the actual string bass, or the double bass. In choir we have basses. In the saxophone world we have the bari sax. In the brass world we've got tubas and, depending on the voicing, a trumpet could be the bass because it's all relative. If you have four trumpets and that's the lowest notes, it's all that they're playing, then that is bass. So again, it's all just context. A flute could have the bass note of a chord as long as it's the lowest note. All right, let's talk about some types of movement, because some of them are going to be allowed and some of them are not. So we want to make sure we're understanding what these things actually are. So in part writing, when we talk about parallel movement, we're talking about movement of two or more voices in the same direction by the same generic interval. It does not have to be the same chromatic interval, meaning we've got a sixth here from E to C. That is a minor sixth. We go to from F to D, that is a major sixth. But the point is that they are both moving up by step from one type of sixth to another type of sixth. So we would call that parallel movement. And this is what this sounds like. So we go from this minor sixth, and then we move up to a major sixth, another major sixth, and then we continue with that. We're not going up anymore, and we're not even going by step. Both voices are going down by skip to where they started. So this measure contains only parallel movement. Sounds nice. So that is parallel movement. Again, same direction, same interval. It doesn't have to be the same quality interval, but if we continue moving and maintaining a sixth or a third or any interval between two voices harmonically, then that it would be parallel movement. Similar motion. Similar motion is similar to parallel motion, but all it means is that the two voices are going in the same direction. They don't have to be the same distance away, even generically or chromatically. It just means they're both going up or they're both going down. So this is an example. This measure has entirely similar motion. We've only got two voices, and they're always going in the same direction. But here we've got a sixth, and it goes up to a fifth, and it goes up to a third, and then they both go down, creating another sixth, which is where we started. So again, this is similar motion, not parallel motion, because we've got a sixth, and then a fifth, and then a third, and then a sixth. But they are always moving up or down together. All right, now we're getting into the quote-unquote rules of part writing. So the scenario would be if you get a figured bass or a Roman numeral analysis with inversions and seventh chords, these are the things you want to keep in mind, aside from just writing the chords correctly, meaning if I'm in the key of F and it says there's an F in the bass and there's nothing underneath, I have to write an F chord. But these are the things I want to keep in mind when I'm actually fleshing out these chords and writing them on the grand staff. So, parallel fifths and octaves should be avoided. We definitely want to avoid parallel fifths and octaves. So here's what we've got in this here. We've got I'll play that again. So does anybody spot the parallel fifths? So there's two voices that are a fifth apart, and then when they move to the next chord, they are still a fifth apart. And if you didn't see it, there it is. We got the bass and tenor singing a perfect fifth. Sorry for the out-of-tuneness of the piano. And then they both move up by step, thus maintaining that fifth. So in order for it to sound like common practice period music, we want to try to avoid stuff like that, because then we sort of get into that. It starts sounding like chant. It doesn't have the same clarity and finesse that we expect from this time period. Let's look at another example. What's going on here? Same thing, either parallel fifths or parallel octaves. Well, I already showed you fifths, so you could probably take a wild guess. Here's what it sounds like. Again. If you missed it, they're not always consecutive voices, meaning there are not always neighbors, they're not always on the same line. So this is actually the soprano and bass are both going from a C to an A. So octaves are relatively easy to spot or hopefully avoid because we've got the same pitch going to the same next pitch. So we've got a C up to a C in the first chord, and then we've got an A up to an A in the second chord. And they're both being they were an octave apart, and they're still an octave apart. So we want to try to avoid that. All right, the next category would be spacing. So some things to keep in mind. The distance between any consecutive two voices of the upper three voices should not exceed an octave. So what that means is between the tenor, the alto, we don't want more than an octave, and between the alto and the soprano, we do not want more than an octave. So that means they should stay relatively close to each other. We don't want the soprano creeping up into the stratosphere We don't want the tenor to be hanging all the way down by the bass. We want everything kind of nice and evenly spaced out, so not too far away, not too close together, so that we're crowding and running out of space to create the next chord. The bass, however, is sort of a free agent. The bass can be more than an octave away from the tenor, and that is not an issue. And you'll find as we go on that a lot of the time the bass is sort of not unrelated, but untethered by the other three voices. It can do things that the other three voices shouldn't, because it's sort of providing a foundation. It has a little bit more flexibility. So the bass can be more than an octave away from the tenor. That is not an issue. Okay, we want to avoid crossing and overlap. These are two terms which are often confused for each other because they are somewhat similar. So voice crossing is a little, if you think of it this way, if you can remember it somehow, voice crossing happens in a moment in time. It happens in a single chord. So it has nothing to do with the transition from one chord to another. Voice crossing means that there is a problem inherent in a single chord regardless of what came before or what comes after the chord. Voice crossing is a problem that can be frozen in time and identified. And that is when consecutive voices go above or below their neighbors. And what I mean by that, an example would be if the tenor sings higher than the alto, or if the soprano sings lower than the alto, for example. So essentially, you don't have the voices in the correct order as far as who's on top, second from the top, second from the bottom, and on the bottom. The most common mistake would be the tenor and the alto because they're on different staves. You've got the alto on the treble line and the tenor in the bass line, and because we have that oversized gap between lines and really only one note in between, which would be middle C, it's easy to miss that because spatially one's still higher than the other, but as far as the actual pitch, it would not be the case. So here's an example of that. We've got the bass, we've got the tenor, and now we've got the alto, and then soprano. It's much easier to spot if it's on the same line, because then you just, oh, well, that's the soprano. If it's higher than the alto, well, then it's the soprano. But in this case, we've got an E in the tenor with the ledger line, and then the alto singing below that with the C. Hearing it would not necessarily make a problem, but if we ended up in that scenario, is a good chance that something else happened that would be noticeable by the ear, meaning some voice jumped really awkwardly and created sort of a jagged, non-fluid movement. All right, so voice crossing happens in a moment of time. Voice overlapping happens from one chord to the next. You can't see voice overlap by looking at a single chord. You have to look at the transition. So this is when a voice sings higher than its upper neighbor did in the previous chord, or when a voice sings lower than its lower neighbor did in the previous chord. And I just want to clarify, when I say sings, it could be playing at the piano, you could be playing the violin. You're not necessarily singing, but it's just because we're talking about voices, that's what I say sing. It doesn't necessarily mean singing. So when a voice sings higher than its upper neighbor just did, or when a voice sings lower than its lower neighbor just did. So here's an example of that. We're going to bring your attention to the treble clef. So in the first chord, the alto's got E, and the soprano has a G. And then the next chord, the alto jumps past where the soprano just was to the A. And it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with this, but if we don't pay attention to the voice overlap rule, we potentially start having a very jagged contour to our melody and our chord transitions, where everything's kind of just going to start to sound like this. And that might be an exaggeration, but that is what we're trying to avoid. We want everything to almost feel like it's breathing in and out, like a wave that kind of crashes and recedes, rather than some sort of jagged, jumping, jarring motion from one chord to the next. So, voice overlap. This is a general rule that kind of helps avoid other mistakes, is to make the parts quote-unquote singable. Now, this does sort of downplay the ability of vocalists when we say singable, because it sort of implies that we can't handle weird jumps and things like that. But the truth is, even if your singers can handle weird jumps and just sing exactly what's on the page, it may or may not sound fluid and refined. So, some ways to make it singable. Try to retain common tones between chords. So, for example, if I have a C chord, and then the next chord, if the next chord is an F chord, so I've got a C, E, G chord, rather than have everybody move to a different note, why don't I have this voice stay on the C, and then same thing, I'm going to pick another chord that has C in it. Let's do an A chord, an A minor chord. And then, if I have to, if there are no common tones, then obviously I would have to switch it. But we want to try to retain common tones. So if there's a note that you need in the next chord that's already in the previous chord, it works really nicely to have that voice that was already playing or singing that note just remain on that note. We also want to try to use mostly stepwise motion. Everything sounds nicer if we can. Stepwise motion is preferred. It's not always possible, but if it is possible, it's preferred. And again, in an effort to keep things fluid and not too jumpy, for lack of a better word, we want to try to avoid skips larger than a fourth. That way we're not just jumping octaves and jumping sevenths or even sixths and fifths. We want to keep the voices relatively fluid and smooth so that the contour is not super, again, jumpy, for lack of a better word. In fact, we want to try to limit the fourths that we do. So if you're thinking, oh, I can do fourths are on the table, that's great. Not a problem, but we want to try to not have every single chord have a skip of a fourth from one to the next to the next to the next. We want to try to limit them if we can. And again, it all goes into the mentality of trying to keep things stepwise and fluid and the contour kind of smooth. And as I mentioned before, the bass line is the exception. We do not need this. The bass line does not need to adhere to this guideline. The bass line can drop an octave, it can jump an octave, it can go down a sixth, it can go up a sixth. The bass line can move a little bit more jaggedly, for lack of a better word, than the upper three voices. And again, the bass line is not tethered to the upper three voices. It has more flexibility. All right, we want to avoid, we talked about similar motion, two voices moving in the same direction. So we want to avoid similar motion in all voices at once. So at least one voice should move in the opposite direction or stay the same, which we call oblique motion. Oh, sorry, let me go back to that one. Just kind of maybe give you an example. I call it, if we're doing similar motion, I call it the lean on me effect. That's, and again, that's very catchy, obviously a very popular song, but not in the common practice period. So try to remember that just because you like something or that it doesn't sound strange to you or doesn't sound weird doesn't mean it's necessarily following these guidelines, because again, we're trying to write music in a relatively specific time and place. So they wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have done a lot of just every single voice moving up or moving down. Even though it doesn't sound that weird to our ears, it would have sounded strange to theirs. And that's what we're trying to understand and achieve. Okay. Preferred doubling. So most chords have only three notes, a root, a third, and a fifth. Some chords have sevenths, in which case we kind of need all 4 voices at our disposal, but a lot of chords, most chords only have 3 pitches in them, and we've got 4 voices, so the question becomes, which note do we have 2 of? Which note do we double? And so there are some restrictions and some guidelines that we want to follow when we're doing that. In second inversion chords, assuming they don't have a 7th, meaning a 6/4 chord, if you will, we always want to double the 5th, which in this case, the 6/4 chord means that the 5th is in the bass. So if you are writing a 6/4 chord, we want to have another voice sing the same note that the bass voice is singing or playing. So we are doubling the 5th in a second inversion chord, assuming it doesn't have a 7th. If it does have a 7th, meaning if we're dealing with a something 4/3, then you don't double anything. You want a root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th. You want all 4 pitches. But in a triad, if it's in second inversion, we want to double the bass note. We never double the leading tone or the 7th of a dominant chord. Really, you shouldn't double any 7th. So that means if we have a 5/7 chord, Sol, Ti, Re, Fa, we definitely don't want a second T. And we also don't want 2 7ths. So we want to make sure that we've got, and even if there isn't a 7th in the chord, we definitely do not want to double the leading tone. So we don't want 2 T's if it's a 5 chord or even a diminished 7 chord. And we'll find out why that's kind of important in a second. We want to avoid doubling the 3rd. In most major and minor chords, it starts to sound like the root. So here's a chord without the 3rd doubled. Let's maybe do this. Or, I don't know. It's sort of just a waste of a voice, I guess, but it is common practice to not double the 3rd. The exception to this is when it's a diminished chord. In a diminished chord, we actually want to double the 3rd. So let's see if I can kind of an example. Oh, that was not good. I don't know what I did there. Anyway, that is the common practice. We want to avoid doubling the 3rd unless it's diminished. All right, this is uber important. Very, very, very important. If you follow no other rules, these are really important rules to follow. These are kind of non-negotiable, which is voice leading. That means we want the leading tone, which is going to be the 3rd in a 5 or 5/7 chord, or the root of a diminished chord. It must resolve up by step, specifically by half step or a minor second. But the leading tone in a 5 or 5/7 chord must resolve up by step. So if we're assuming we're in C, there's that B in the tenor voice, resolving up, and then the 7th of really any chord, which in this case there's a G and then a B, and then we don't have a D in this chord. There's that 7th in the alto voice with the stem going down. Fa, we want it to resolve down to Mi. Cool. So, leading tone in a 5 chord. If the leading tone can exist in other chords, but if it's in a 5 chord, that means it's functioning as the leading tone and it's pulling us to 1, so it better go up that half step to 1. Ti, Do. And then the 7th of really any chord, but especially if it's a 5/7 chord, it needs to resolve down by step. So here is, again, we've got the leading, we also call these tendency tones, the leading tone and the 7th, because they tend, or really kind of need to, go in a particular direction. So we've got the leading tone, Ti, Do, and then the 7th, Fa, Mi. That is how that works, and it really needs to happen. Some of the other ones are less egregious, but if you don't do these things, it's a blatant error. There's the leading tone, and there's the 7th resolving down by step. All right. This is not really a part writing rule, but just something to be aware of, and it becomes very relevant when you are part writing, is that there are only 4 acceptable types of second inversion chords, or I should say second inversion triads. So if you are writing, or even if you're analyzing, it's good to keep in mind that there are really only these 4. So if you find yourself writing another one or doing analysis and you find that you're writing something that isn't one of these 4, you've probably made a mistake. Or I have, but more likely you've made a mistake, no offense. And if you're taking the AP exam, it's almost definitely you that made a mistake. But I definitely make mistakes sometimes. So there are really only 4 acceptable types of second inversion chords, and we need to know what they are. So here we go. We have the cadential 6/4, the passing 6/4, and the neighbor/pedal 6/4. And then there is a 4th kind, which is not as commonly used, and it's kind of not, I don't think it really fits in with the other 3, but it is in the curriculum, so we need you to know arpeggiated 6/4. So let's go through these real quick. A cadential 6/4 chord is specifically a 1/6/4 resolving to 5 or 5/7. That sounds like this. And the hallmark is that it's on that dominant note, do, re, mi, fa, sol, and it either repeats or drops down the octave or jumps up the octave to the exact same note. So it's just sol, sol, do. So essentially what we have is we have this dominant feel in the bass, but it's still a 1 chord. Definitely doesn't feel resolved because it's not in root position. And then we get this dominant chord. We're thinking, oh, okay, now I'm really pulling, and now we finally get the payoff to 1. So again, cadential 6/4 chord, because it usually happens leading up to a cadence. 1/6/4/5. More than likely resolving to 1. A passing 6/4. It gets its name because if we look at the bass line motion, it is just passing through, moving up by step or sometimes down by step, passing through that middle chord. So again, it sounds like this. And if we went backwards, it'd be the same thing. So it's a 1 followed by a 5/6/4, continuing up to a 1/6. And again, this progression can be flipped backwards, and it's the same thing. The idea is that the 5/6/4 is a transition chord from just getting to a 1 chord to some other inversion of that 1 chord. Like getting from 1 to a 1/6 or from a 1/6 to a 1. But it's stepwise motion in the bass. Do, re, mi, or mi, re, do is kind of the dead giveaway of a passing 6/4. The neighbor or pedal 6/4. The hallmark of this one is that the bass is oblique. It does not move. We've actually got the do, do, do. And then the reason it's called pedal is because this note does not go away. It stays like it's a pedal tone. Do, do, do. The reason it's sometimes called a neighbor as well is if we look at the tenor and the alto voices, they're just going to their upper neighbor. Sol, la, sol, and mi, fa, mi. So that is the neighbor or pedal 6/4. It's specifically almost always a 1 to a 4/6/4 back to 1, but the main point is that the bass line is oblique. The bass note doesn't change even though the chord does. And arpeggiated just means the chord doesn't change at all. It just means we're having some bass motion without any harmonic movement. We're not going to another Roman numeral, we're just... And there could be even, you could use the 1/6 in there as well. It's not what's written on the screen, but... So maybe you do something like this. But the point is, it is a 1-6-4 that does not go to 5. It's just really making the bass line more interesting, just going to 1. All right, I hope this was helpful. I believe that's the last slide. Boop, it is. So hopefully that was helpful, at least to plant seeds. I'm sure many or most of you will have questions, and we'll just kind of start working on clarifying those and potentially, probably, well, very soon, starting to actually realize figured bass examples, meaning write them in 4 parts, trying our best to follow these guidelines. Good luck, and let me know if you have questions.